where you just have like a little superscript number at the end. And then others, they want an explicit, Michael Harris is, a scholar at the University of Memphis, has done extensive research in blah, 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 period. He argues that, quotation, citation. So it really varies depending on what your field is.
Hey Lisa, is that, I've never heard that term signposting before. Does that include like is that like footnotes and stuff, or just stuff you put like in the paper itself?
Usually it's just in the paper itself.
Oh, okay.
Signposting, footnotes are sort of explanatory notes sometimes, or citations.
Right.
But signposting is the words that indicate that your argument is shifting gears, that you're transitioning from one section to the next.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yes, it's something that is easier to do in person and we don't often notice it.
Gotcha.
But in writing, it can be really helpful, especially when you're dealing with dissertation level ideas where they're super complex.
Shifting these big, okay, got it.
Yes. And then proofreading is sort of the last component to the puzzle, where it's, like I said before, grammar, spelling, making sure your ideas are expressed well, making sure that that is the right word to say that, making sure, for example, your audience knows what all your words mean, checking your punctuation, formatting, that kind of thing. Okay, now this is, my illustration of the writing cycle. A lot of times people think of it as just sort of one long, arduous trek, and really it's a very recursive process where you start with your first draft that may just be an outline or some notes, and you say, okay, so I have this bit of information. What do I need to add to it? So you're going to send it to your chair, your committee. They're going to send it back with some feedback. You're going to make those changes or additions, and then you're going to send it back to them. And so you keep doing this over and over, basically, until you and your committee say, that's good enough. We're real done. And so your feedback that you get may include suggestions from all three levels in the same draft. They may say, oh, well, you weren't going to talk about that first, were you? Even if you've only sent them 3 paragraphs. But this is a cycle, and I really want folks to start thinking of it that way, where it's not just one set of round of editing and you're done. This is something you need to do several times. So when do you actually do one versus the other? So revising typically starts the earliest in the dissertation process, and there's usually several rounds until you get a hang of your argument. There's less revision level stuff necessary if you're in a field that uses a very prescribed thing where you're like, here's my methods section, here's my results section. Usually you don't have to worry about organization as much because it's very prescribed. Editing doesn't start until a chapter or section is mostly finished. Usually it'll be like 2/3 the way done. You feel really good about it. It's readily identifiable as a dissertation chapter or an article. But there's still several rounds of editing is pretty common as you sort of work things out. And then proofreading is the very last time or two that you actually look at the dissertation before submission. You'll go through, make any of those last little corrections, and then move it through that section very quickly. Okay, so now that we're sort of on the same page with that, the next step is, what approach do you take? How do you actually go about doing these? And so there's sort of 2 schools of thought here. You can either do fewer passes and have major changes and huge progress with every draft, or you can do many more passes and have smaller changes with each draft. And there's pros and cons to both, and it just depends on your personality type and how you're feeling in a particular week. So if you do fewer passes, you're still looking at like 3 to 5 times that you revise and edit and proofread your paper. It's going to feel like huge jumps in progress once the changes are done. But until those are done, it feels like your paper is in terrible shape and it's just a giant mess. Often the paper will look like it's just bleeding red ink, which can be really overwhelming and disheartening. If you're the kind of person and this is me, I fall into the second camp that prefers more passes and smaller changes. You might do 7 to 20 plus passes. And then you always feel like you're making progress, but it's very like slow, steady progress. The flip side is there's a lot less red ink, which at least for me makes me feel much better about myself. So pros and cons continued here. A lot of times for the fewer passes and major changes route, a lot of the revising and editing happens simultaneously, and same for editing and proofreading. Just because you're not going through it as often. One of the cons is that it's hard to keep track of all the like individual feedback points, and so you have to make sure nothing gets overlooked. It's also easy to get bogged down and disheartened when you're sorting through this and you're like, I have 75 things I have to change on this one page. I am never getting through this because I have 50 more pages in this chapter to go. But at the end of it, you can sort of ride that high of major improvement for quite a while. The flip side of that is on the more passes, smaller changes route, revising, editing, and proofreading are more likely to be separate tasks. But you end up with having a ton of files or copies of the paper to juggle and keep track of, because you definitely want to save all of those. You don't want to be one of these poor people whose dissertation ends up deleted because their computer died, or the cloud had some error, or your account got hacked and it's gone. So if you have print copies available and a file saved in multiple places, you can like recreate it much more easily if you have the drafts saved separately. You also get the great feeling of having fresh drafts very often, which I love. That's my favorite part. It can seem like an endless cycle, but I mean, writing is just that away. That's how drafting is used. Okay, so how do you actually go about doing this? My recommendations here are: 1, save or print separate copies of your paper for every single new draft, so you have it like I just mentioned. Create a system in advance so it's super clear, easy to keep track of which draft is the most current one. And then progress becomes very clear, so you can flip back to your first couple of drafts and say, oh, look at all this work I've done, I'm so smart. Super great for your mental health there. 2, if you're physically making changes, use brightly colored ink, or in your word processing program, use the track changes function. That is a game changer. It makes changes easy to find on the document. And if you're using ink instead of pencil and handwriting them, stuff can't get like smudged either. It also lets you mark the changes. Oh, the other thing, I want you to mark the changes and then go back later and fix them. Don't try to fix it in the moment as you're editing. You'll get too bogged down in that. Just mark it and move on. Next piece of advice is only focus on one element of revising, editing, or proofreading at a time. So if you're going through and saying, okay, I need to make sure every part of my argument is actually tied back to it explicitly, just focus on that and don't get sidetracked with, oh, where did I put that source? There's no citation here. I should hunt that down. Don't worry about it. Make a note to yourself and come back to it later. Those kinds of concerns you don't need to worry about at that point, which leads me to, my last note for that one, which is leave notes to yourself in the text to come back to it. And you can see here what I did on this slide, like make it in bold, all caps, highlight it so that you don't forget that it's an important change that you have to make. The other thing, and this can be really hard, especially if you're a procrastinator, which I also am, I have all the worst habits. Give yourself a break from the paper. Let it sit for at least 24 hours between drafts or writing sessions. A week is better if you can swing it, but an hour is better than nothing. So step away from a little bit and then come back to it later when your ideas and your brain is more fresh, when you've had a moment to rest, get some coffee or tea, whatever you need. Okay, so here's the nitty-gritty parts. Actual revising techniques. This is for revision level things, sort of first the passes. On the one side of the screen, I've got like questions to think about. And then on the other side are some actual like tactics. So first, the questions. Does it follow the plan that you and your committee have worked on for your dissertation? Do you have a prospectus or an outline? Usually there's a proposal. Is it lining up with that? How much wiggle room do you have to make changes or deviations from that? Some committees are like, sure, it's just a suggestion. And others are very serious. No, you need to follow what we've assembled. Are you including all of the required elements? If you have, or if you're in a field where you need to include the methodology, the results, the conclusions, be sure that all of those parts are present. If you're in a field where it's more argument-based, are you effectively making an argument? Yes or no? And if it's no, go back and add that in. And does it demonstrate your understanding of the topic? How could you write in such a way to better demonstrate your understanding? So different ways you can do to make sure that you're answering these questions well is one, create a reverse outline. So let your dissertation sit for a minute, come back and re-outline the chapter. Go through paragraph by paragraph, section by section and say, oh, okay, in this paragraph, I'm doing this, in that paragraph, I'm doing that. Create a reverse outline and watch out for weird outliers that need to be moved elsewhere. And you can make a little note, flag them in some way, so you can go back later and move them to a more appropriate section. A similar idea is to write each idea that you want to cover on a separate note card. And then you can like lay them out in front of you. If you're a tactile learner, lay them out in front of you so you can rearrange your dissertation into a really effective order. Another thing you can do is highlight different elements in different colors. So like just vertically on the page next to each paragraph, say things on this particular topic are going to be pink, these ones are going to be blue, these ones are going to be green. So you can literally see the different threads and how they come together. That will help you do several things. One, make sure that each of the threads is presented in a balanced way. If you only have 2 paragraphs in a 45-page chapter on a particular topic, do you need to include it? Maybe you should handle it differently. Maybe it should appear just in your introduction instead of a body chapter. The other thing it can help with is you can use highlighting to track your source material. So you can highlight your writing in one color and all of your source material in a different color. So you can say, oh, I went a whole page and it's all other people's ideas. I need to fix that. Obviously, that's different if you're in the literature review section, but you still need like your analysis of the literature. It's not just quotes. That's not good, or paraphrasing. Okay, this last one I have listed here is kind of a fun one if you have the time and energy to do it. I like to call it the cutting room floor exercise. So what you would do is take your chapter, divide out each sentence so it's on its own separate line, print it off, and then cut it into separate strips of paper, and then like shuffle them all together. It makes a giant mess, but then you can put the sentences back in order. I recommend numbering them in advance, or marking them on the back or something so you can kind of keep track of where that sentence appears. But then you can sort of, it's a like super extra version of the note card one that I talked about earlier. But it can be a lot of fun, especially if you get together with a friend and do it. And so you do each other's papers then. That can be a lot of fun and very interesting to see. Okay, editing techniques. For this one, I've got some more questions and then actual techniques. So the first question when you're editing is always, who is my audience? And for dissertations and theses, it's usually experts in the field, but not necessarily this topic. So if you're in theater, it might be somebody that's really, that, you know, they're a theater professors, they know about it, but maybe you're studying early theater and they're more into later theater or whatever. So you've got some leeway there. The other thing that I always like to remind folks is that you are actually the foremost scholar on your dissertation topic. Your committee may or may not actually know a ton about your topic. They may just be the closest people to your field, but you are the foremost expert on it. So you need to write that way, as if you're writing for anyone who knows less about it than you, which is literally everyone. Yeah, exactly. Michael says his community knew nothing about the topic, which, I mean, fair, it happens that way sometimes. I actually have 2 chairs, one for the first half of my dissertation and one for the second half, and they don't know much about the other half. They just sort of wing it. They're still in my field, they're still study literature, but you know, they're different areas. So then once you figure out who your audience is, what you have to figure out what they already know, and then what don't they know that you need to tell them. And then the less fun part is, what are the conventions in your field? And these can vary wildly depending on the discipline. Some disciplines are really into passive voice, some you have to use active voice, some are very, very strict about writing only in the third person. Others use sort of a first person plural. We did this, even if you're the only one doing that research. So you have to sort of figure out what the conventions are for your field. The best way to do this is read books and articles on it. And those will most likely be the sources that you're using, would be the best place to begin there. But it's also helpful here to talk to your committee and see kind of what they're looking for, because ultimately they're the ones that you have to make happy with this, so that they can sign off and you can get graduated. So actual like techniques and things to do here. Number 1, spell check and grammar check. It's there for a reason, use it. If you have technical terms or weird spellings, go ahead and just add them to your computer's spell check dictionary. It's super easy to do. And then it will add that and it can proofread that for you. So I write on 18th or 17th century theater. So you've never seen so many unusual name spellings in your life. So I just add all of them to my spell check dictionary. And then the bizarre way that they spell Isabella, I know is done correctly every time. Whoops. So next up, paragraphs is a good starting point, are usually 5 to 8 sentences. If you're widely deviant from that, you know, maybe take a look. Maybe that paragraph's missing something. Maybe it's too long. Your paragraph generally shouldn't be longer than 1 page, double spaced. If it is, it becomes really hard for the reader to follow. And while it's not a deal breaker, it does sort of have this psychological effect on your committee as they're reading. Let's see, pronoun use should also be consistent. So if you're supposed to write in the first person, be consistent throughout. If you're supposed to write in the third person, go ahead and use the find function, either Control F or Command F on your keyboard, to find all instances of I, me, we, you, your, so you can cut them from your paper. Other techniques, this one is best done alone, is read your paper aloud, like at an actual speaking volume. This will catch so many mistakes and so many places where it just sounds weird and you're like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Any time that you stumble over words there, just mark it and keep reading. Don't try to fix it in that moment. Just mark it, underline it, whatever, and keep going. But reading it aloud makes a big difference. I mentioned passive versus active voice. Check for that at the editing stage. And then the last one, and this one's kind of bonkers, read it backwards, sentence by sentence, aloud again. This will catch more of the smaller errors and any places where if the sentence doesn't make sense on its own like that, you're probably missing some words and your reader might not be able to follow what you're talking about. Does that make sense? Michael, you're the only person I see, so does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I've never actually considered that point. I mean, basically most of that, like, especially reading it as aloud is like my best technique, but I've never thought about reading it out backwards.
It's one of my favorite tools. I teach it hard in my first year writing classes.
Yes.
My cousins actively use it.
Great.
We read everything backwards because you get caught up in the flow of your paper and your brain knows what you're trying to say.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I love the backwards tool.
Yes, it's wonderful. Yeah, I always had my students when I taught composition do it, and they also loved the cutting room floor exercise.
Yeah.
That one was also fun. It's much easier with like a 10-10 or 10-20 paper than it is just a chapter.
Right,
chapter.
yeah.
But it's still a fun one to try if you're like feeling stuck and like hating your work.
Yeah. I would say with the cutting room floor exercise too, I did that on the last article I got published, and we didn't do it sentence by sentence, but we did it like section by section. So it forced us to read the section to see if it was complete, and also helped the organization.
Awesome. I'm so glad that some of this is sounding familiar. So hopefully I can move it along more if you guys want. Okay, so proofreading techniques. Whoops. Let me move this over. So I do not recommend starting proofreading until you've done all of the revising and editing, mostly because if you make changes to those sections, you then have to proofread them again. And you don't, when you add new material, you risk introducing new errors. Also use spell check and grammar check again. Yes, really do it again. I promise there will still be problems. Check your page numbers and your reading head, make sure that they are correct. Check that your font and style are all the same size, color, and correct font. The other thing that grad students tend to do is worry too much about, whoops, I went the wrong way. Orphan and widow control. So don't worry about single lines or words going on to the next page. The word processors have orphan and widow control. It's just a box that you can check that will keep things together. So you won't have one random word on a page by itself or one random line on a page by itself. That's handled. Also, proofreading is a good time to cross-reference your in-text citations with your bibliography. Make sure that all your in-text citations are in the bibliography if they need to be, and vice versa. And again, your control find function on your keyboard, super helpful here. This is also a good time to go through the graduate school's formatting checklist, which I will link in the resources page as well. Make sure that you're following all of their criteria.
Can I interrupt you
yeah,
again?
absolutely.
I'm sorry.
No,
The orphan and widow control. So you said that there's because I always worry about, I'll have a table and like my title will be on one page and my stuff will be on the next. It's like, no, so I, do these hard returns trying to, but then when I edit something or revise it, then I have to go back and, so you said there was some feature you can click or.
Yes, so it's
Okay.
orphan and widow control. Usually
Okay.
it's in, let me pull up Word here.
Yeah, because I've always worried about that. I did not know that was a thing. Okay.
It is a thing. It's under the paragraph settings.
Okay.
And on the second tab for line and page breaks. It's the first
Perfect.
one
I will
under
check that out.
pagination.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yes. Usually I think it's checked by default, but it is a game changer.
Gotcha.
And
okay.
that's the other thing with your tables and figures. Don't worry about formatting them till the very end.
Okay.
Do it at the proofreading stage.
Okay.
Because if you add a single line someplace else, it might bump that table down.
Right. Exactly.
Just a headache. So just save it till the end. It can look ugly until then.
Yeah.
Totally fine. And the graduate school has all sorts of rules about tables and figures as well. So just waiting till the end to make sure they're done right then can be very helpful. Okay, the other one technique that I like to recommend to folks for proofreading is zoom out. So in Word, there's a way to set the zoom to like 120% or set it down so it's like 60 or 70%. So you can see the whole page on there at once, but you can't quite read the text. That's a really good way to find anything that stands out and is different. So if you have copied and pasted stuff in from a source instead of retyping the whole quotation, sometimes it comes in a different font, different color, different size, and that zooming out is a great way to do it, to make sure that everything looks right. It's also an excellent way to find any notes that you left for yourself any extra lines or blank pages. Similar to the orphan and widow control is use Control Enter or Command Enter to insert a page break instead of just hitting enter a bunch. For the same reason that I mentioned with the tables, hitting enter a bunch can make your other pages weird. So just hitting Control Enter inserts a page break. Let's see. Oh, the other thing for checking size, font, and color is check your page numbers too, and your headers. A lot of times they end up being a different font. So I've happened all the time with my students where like Word defaults to Calibri or something stupid. And you're like, this needs to be Times New Roman. And so the paper is, but the page numbers are not.
You can set up a default new normal template and have it so all of that is done,
Yes.
Which I always highly recommend for students.
Yes, me too. And Google's a super helpful resource for this stuff. If you're having trouble with your tables, with your headers or page numbers, just Google that. If you ask somebody, that's at the libraries or wherever in your department, that's the first thing they're going to do. So save yourself the headache. And if you're an anxious person, potential embarrassment, and just Google it. And then if you still can't find it, then ask for some help there. Okay. So it seems like at least some of you have a grasp on like some revising and editing stuff if you've taught composition at all. Handling feedback though can be really tricky. It's very stressful for everybody. I don't know anyone who's like, oh goody, I got 12 pages of notes from my committee chair. No one likes that. It's very nerve-wracking, if only because it's how much work you have to do now. It can also cause a lot of anxiety. So I always want to remind folks, writing is a skill and a process. It improves with practice and it's recursive in nature. So that wheel I showed at the beginning, you can just stay on that wheel until you feel good about your writing and your work. The other thing I want to remind folks of is your writing quality is entirely unrelated to your worth as a person. I'm going to say that again. It is entirely unrelated to your worth as a person. Writing takes a lot of time, practice, and patience. And so please be patient with yourselves. The dissertation and PhD is a grueling, arduous process. And you have to take some time out and just be kind to yourself with it as well, especially during the writing stages, which can be so isolating. So definitely go out with some friends, have a nice quiet evening, whatever you need to do to stay happy and healthy and grounded while doing this. And I want to reiterate that here because the editing and revising and proofreading process is usually near the end of the program when you're really tapped out and fried and ready to be done. Okay, so there's 3 common reactions to feedback: anxiety, defensiveness, and frustration. So anxiety usually looks like, oh no, I'll fail this and then I will never graduate and then I won't get a job and I'm going to be like poor and homeless and living under a bridge with my dog. No, that's not usually how this works. Defensiveness. Oh, well, that feedback is a terrible idea and there's no way I'm going to do that. That person doesn't know what they're talking about. We'll talk about that in a second. And then frustration. Well, why didn't they comment on what I actually needed help with? Why'd they talk about all this other stuff? I don't care about that. So first, remember that the comments are about the paper. They're not about you as a human being. And 2, sort of solutions for each of these feelings is 1 for the anxiety. You can revise indefinitely. So you can ask for help from your peers, from the writing center, from your committee, so that your paper will eventually get good enough that they will approve it and you can graduate. For the defensiveness, I like to think of it as it's your paper, your choice. You do not have to go with every suggestion that is given to you. If you have ever done any publishing work and spent time on the academic internet, I'm certain you've seen all of the reviewer 2 memes. You can assign a committee member as the reviewer 2 and think of them that way in your head. You're like, oh, committee member Michael Harris is the worst. He always has these terrible suggestions and just wants me to write a totally different paper. Michael, this is about 17th century English drama, not Japanese film. Come on.
I mean, if you ask a stupid question to me, you're going to get a stupid answer back.
So you do not have to go with everything that's suggested. You can just ignore it and do the things that matter to you from the feedback. And for the frustration, if they're not commenting on stuff that you want help with, give them a specific list to work with. Say, these are the areas I'm struggling with, or I'm particularly interested in hearing your thoughts about X, Y, and Z. You can also find somebody else. If you've been working with someone from the CWC or a peer, get someone else if they're not doing what you want. If it's a committee member, maybe you have somebody else read your chapters for you. And I don't know if you guys have talked about this at all before in other sessions, but you can also change your committee. If you're really butting heads with your chair or a committee member, you can switch it up. It happens all the time. Departments are prepared for that to some extent. You just don't want to burn too many bridges with that. All right. So other notes on handling anxiety related to your feedback is if you're just really terrified about it, start with somebody that's either uninvested or likes you first for you. So go to the writing center. They don't care about your dissertation. You're just another paper. They look at tons of them. They're very good about no judgment. Go to a friend or family member, because I guarantee they're going to know even less about this than anybody else. And they're going to read it and go, why, Michael, you're just brilliant. I had no idea how smart you were. I didn't understand a word of it. Or you can go to one of your peers or colleagues in your program. They're going to be familiar with some of the terms and lingo, maybe not all of it, but they'll be able to read it and say, oh, yeah, I think this is okay. Or, well, maybe you need some help here. And then that gives you some practice getting feedback and incorporating it so that you can learn how to handle the anxiety. Just like anything else, the first few times you do a new thing, you're a little nervous about it on some level. And so for this, the more you get feedback, the less of a big deal it becomes. Other suggestions I have when you receive feedback is have a peer or family member read the feedback for you first and then give you the gist of it. A friend of mine in the English program and I used to do this all the time. We would read each other's feedback and say, oh yeah, mostly this is pretty good. Or, well, there's a couple doozies in there. You've got some work to do. And it sort of preps you for it so you can get in the right headspace to have a good go at it. The other thing you can do is a lot of times when committees give feedback, they give like a paragraph or a page at the end of like comprehensive notes. And then you might read that first and then go back through and go page by page. So you don't get like little tidbits and you're like, oh God, every page is worse than the last. What am I going to do? And you get to the end and they're like, oh yeah, overall, this is in really good shape. There's just like some little quibbly things to change. You're like, wait, what? But there was 75 comments in the first 5 pages. What do I do about that? So it can be kind of, there's a disconnect there sometimes. The other thing you can do to help with that is read your colleagues' feedback that they get on their papers together with them and with your own so that you guys can like practice reading and interpreting the feedback. Well, what does it mean when this professor says this? What does that kind of suggestion indicate? And sort of use your analytical skills that you've developed in your coursework on the feedback. And then that becomes your subject of study and sort of takes the edge off of it a little bit. And if you've taught writing at all, you know that things can come off weird, especially if they've been looking at 5 different people's dissertation chapters that day. Like this might have been the last one and they might have been fresh out of kindness, which is unfortunate, but happens. Professors are human too. Okay. So one of the best ways to get good at receiving feedback is be good at giving feedback. And you can use the focus points here sort of as a template when you're asking for feedback from folks specifically, is identify any strengths, identify any weak or missing portions of the paper, be specific with your comments instead of saying, oh, it was kind of confusing. Say in the third paragraph on page 6, I don't understand what's happening, or this particular sentence on this page is unclear. Specificity helps immensely. Be constructive. Don't just say, oh, this was a bad paragraph. Well, why was it bad? What doesn't work about it? How can I do it differently? And then ask the author questions so that they can address concerns or clarify that section. So you might provide notes like, is this what you mean? And then sort of describe it. And then one of the reasons why I think helping others is giving feedback improves your own writing. You can start looking at your own papers with a more critical eye for spotting strengths and weaknesses and then articulating them. And once you can articulate it, then it becomes much easier to fix it. So that when you review your own work, you're much more competent at it. All right, next up. So this is kind of my template that I like to recommend for how to actually get through all of the commentary from committee members. Is one, you actually have to read all the comments and then just let them sit for a day or two. Put it back in the folder, close that email, ignore it, let them percolate in the back of your brain. Mentally gird yourself to come back to it, to look at them again. And then before you open your own dissertation chapter, get out a pen and paper and write out what their major concerns are. What are the highest order things that you have to fix first? Then go through what themes do you have for the mid-level issues? So these are going to be many of them for most folks. And then same for the low-level ones. Are you using this kind of phrasing too much? Are you not signposting? Do you have source use issues? Like, what are the general categories of areas that need work for mid and low level issues? Don't try to get all of them, just the gist. And then let it sit for another day or two if you've got time. Mentally prepare to come back to it, and then actually sit down and start revising, editing, or proofreading based on your particular notes of their comments. And then go back again and revise based on their actual comments. That way you get all of them included that you want to include. And then you can let it sit for a couple days. And from there, make sure that everything's been incorporated, make sure that your understanding of the comments hasn't changed. Sometimes the first time you read it, you interpret it one way, and then you come back later and you interpret it differently. And then take any notes on questions you have for them. Just like they're asking you questions in their feedback, you might have questions for them about the feedback. Oh, you said you weren't sure about this or that. What is unclear? You might come back at them with some things. And again, let it sit for another couple days, and submit any other questions you have, make those changes, and then submit your new draft. And then you can coast along for a little bit till they give you more feedback, and then you start over again and go through this process. But we've talked about this a little bit, where letting stuff sit and rest and walking away from it can be really helpful during revising, editing, and proofreading, so that your brain comes at it with fresh eyes and you're not too used to what it says. You might be misremembering it. You might be filling in info that isn't actually there without realizing it. And I'm not saying you just let it sit for a week and do nothing for your dissertation. Surely you have another chapter to work on. You have formatting stuff you can fix. There's always something else to do. There's always paperwork and stuff. But letting it sit is really helpful, especially if you can plan for it. Okay, so here's that writing cycle again, where you start with that first draft, And this is sort of a visual of what I just talked about. And eventually you can just keep going on this over and over until you and your committee reach a point where you're just ready to be done. You're like, all right, this is as good as it's going to get. Let's jump ship. And so you jump out of the cycle. And it's important to make that decision because writing is never truly finished. I feel like you either just get so sick of it, of working on it, that you're like, all right, we're done. Or you come up against a deadline where you have to submit it. Otherwise, you have to start recertifying coursework or something. Okay, so here are some resources. The University Libraries has tons. The first one is the writing help guide that I put together that goes over some of what we've talked about here today. We also have tons of resource tutorials, help videos, all kinds of ways to get help through our Ask Librarian stuff. We also have research appointments that I'm certain Michael has talked to you about, where if you are stuck with any part of the research process, you can set up a one-on-one meeting with us, and Michael has those available.
Yeah, a lot of these are linked on the DWR guide, which I realize I still have not actually emailed out the link to our current cohort. I do need to add the writing help guide to that lib guide, I will say.
I might have done that already.
Maybe. Actually, I'll double check.
Okay. Other things that I wanted to share with y'all that are helpful are the thesis and dissertation preparation guide. This is from the graduate school. It's what they use. It's their checklist when you submit your dissertation to them. It's the checklist they go through to make sure it meets all of the publication requirements. Looking at that very early in the process can help, and sort of pre-setting up your document in their format can make your life at the end of the dissertation much easier because the running head is already sorted, the page numbers are done correctly, your title page is already handled. I've also listed the graduate school's contact info, just in case you've got questions. Like for a lot of your program stuff, they're going to be the ones that will have the answers. I've linked the homepage for the CWC and how to schedule sessions with them. And I'm certain that Michael has mentioned this, or they have in their sessions, that they do not do the proofreading and editing for you. They will work with you to look for areas that need improvement and then help you get them done. But it's not someplace where you submit your paper and then they send it back polished and pretty. You actually have to do the work yourself. But they will work with you to do some of these things that we've talked about here today. Okay, so we've got a few minutes here. What questions do y'all have?
That was really good, Lisa. That was so much information. That was awesome. I've got a whole page here of notes and stuff. That's awesome.
Great. I will share with Michael the slides as well, so everyone can have those too.
And I did start recording it, but I missed the beginning because I forgot.
We're all human.
Yeah, I mean, some of that stuff is, as you know, stuff we teach in first year writing or whatever, but some of that stuff was, I'd never even heard of some of that stuff, and that's going to be like life-changing.
Yes. And I mean, that's the thing with a lot of these skills is, sure, we teach it in first year writing, but it applies no matter what level of writing.
We have to practice it too, right?
Yes. We can't just tell other people to do it. We actually have to do it ourselves.
Because I'm really bad about that whole editing, proofreading, revising just turns into one big, like, screw it, I'm rewriting it.
Oh, yeah.
I do that a lot. I sit down with the paper, and I'm just going to read it one more time before I send it to my committee. And then 2 weeks later, I've rewritten the entire thing again. And it's like, at some point you have to let it go.
Yes, you do. You've got to just stop, say, this is good. It doesn't have to be perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect dissertation. It just has to be good enough to get you graduated so you can get on with the rest of your life.
That's what Dr. Graham tells me, is it doesn't have to be the best thing you've ever written. It's the first thing, and you're not trying to change the world. The best dissertation is the done one.
She is brilliant. I mean, she's very correct. She's been doing this for a minute and she knows.
So I was trying to think, there was something I wanted to mention and I'd forgotten it, but now I just remembered it. And that is when assessing feedback, when taking feedback, taking criticism in all aspects of your dissertation, it is important to remember that in 99.9% of all cases, your advisor or your committee are your biggest supporters and cheerleaders. There's always that case with the dissertation chair who just is out of touch, or someone who takes a disliking to you and then does everything they can to make your life miserable. But in most cases, your chair and your committee, they want you to succeed. And so in all the feedback, everything you get from them, remember that they want you to succeed, because in many ways, their name is going to be forever attached to you.
Yes.
And where you go and your successes reflect on them.
Yes.
So many of us tend to feel like we have an adversarial relationship with these people, but remember, they want you to succeed. They want you to graduate, but they're still not going to let you through with subpar work.
Yes. Side note, a lot of times the number of doc students that are graduated each semester is tied to their department funding. So they definitely want you to graduate for financial reasons as well as personal ones. So when you go to a conference and say to somebody, oh yes, I studied with Dr. Graham, she won't feel embarrassed that you're out there saying her name to folks. So they do want you to be good and competent. And I feel like the dissertation in some ways is a giant hazing ritual. But there are new ways to do dissertations. In some fields, it's acceptable to, instead of submitting one giant dissertation, to submit a series of published articles instead, which is cool, because for some fields, that's much more relevant. If you're in the hard sciences, that's what they're after. They almost never publish books because they're outdated so quickly. For like arts and literature, the dissertation and the monograph is still the gold standard there. But yeah, there's starting to be some choice in academia, which is nice.
Yeah.
I have a question for just
Yeah.
kind of everybody. So right now I'm still just submitting my chapters to my chair. I had to submit for letters of recommendation. I had to submit my first chapter to the people that were writing my letters of rec, but it wasn't for a point of like getting feedback. It was more just so they could speak to my research.
Yeah.
So I'm really only getting feedback from one person right now. And like for anyone that ever taught composition, like it's pretty standard practice that we have students write reflections of their drafts, like a reflection page of their draft when they submit it, in which you have to like point out the things you need help with. So I've been like doing that when I submit to my chair, where I'm just like,
Perfect.
okay, so like I'm submitting this, I know the ending's not working, I'm getting stuck here. Are these citations working? Does my method seem like messy? You know, like I'll send little things and questions for her feedback. But she's a writing pedagogue, so like that's our language to each other.
Yes.
So has anyone ever tried doing that outside of that kind of relationship, and was it beneficial? Because like for me, I don't know if it's just because like it's what I teach, but I don't feel like I can submit anything for feedback without like doing a reflection of it, in which I say like I'm really struggling with A, B, C, and D. So I don't know if anyone else was doing that kind of process when they were getting feedback from their whole committee.
I did a little bit, Angela, just kind of for my own purposes. It might have been in response to Tucker's feedback initially, but I think I was just doing it to kind of get my own
Yeah.
thoughts out. Like when I was kind of hitting those bumps in the road and I could not figure out where to go from where I was, I would start kind of writing my own reflection. Okay, this is where I am. This is where I want to go. And eventually that bump would kind of smooth itself out and I would figure out how to make it from point A to point B.
Were you submitting? So like right now, I just submit my chapter. Like, I mean, I submit completed chapters, but I submit them when there's nothing else I can do with them. Like mentally, I'm just like out of space. I've given it time, I've given it dedication. I've stepped away, I've come back. Like, and then eventually I'm just like, fuck it. Like, here it is, you know, like that's kind of how I know when to submit. Like, and I don't know if that's the right way to be submitting chapters to your dissertation chair, but that's how I do it.
So
It was just go.
there are definitely wrong ways to do it, but there's so many right ways to submit.
Yeah.
And that's a great way to, if that's what works for you and your committee, go for it. If you're finding you're not submitting very often, if it's taking you 6 or 9 months to finish a chapter, submit before that point so they
Yeah.
can see it and say, hey, this has been like pulling teeth. This is what I got. What can I do? So that you don't spend too much time going down the wrong path, and they can sort of course correct in little ways ahead of time. Instead of you going off this way and they're like, no, wait, you have to back up and go this way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I mean, if it works for you guys, go for it. There's lots and lots of right ways to establish that relationship and that protocol.
I mean, how have you guys decided when it was time to get feedback?
Well, I'll say this, Angela, I started, last night I ran all my stuff through SPSS, and one thing is great. Like, okay, so I have all this statistical significance, which makes me very happy, and that's great. But I'm not a statistician, so I don't understand really what all of it means. I know the statistical significance is there, and I know that that's a good thing in this case with a corpus and all that. So what I've been doing actually this morning is I was kind of writing up a little note to Dr. Adams to submit. I'm going to submit this results chapter to her specifically with a note saying, okay, so this is this and this is this. Does it mean what I'm saying here? And like that. So I'm going to send very specific notes to her on this chapter, even though she hasn't given me feedback on any other chapter yet, because she's specifically there because she's a quantitative person.
Yeah. And it's usually pretty standard practice to submit to just your chair or just one of committee member until the end. I'm submitting to both of my chairs throughout the whole process because they're both pretty invested. They just comment more on one end or the other.
I think something has to do if like, do you have people on your committee that are specific? Like I have people like Romy is specifically there for corpus stuff. Adam's specifically there for quantitative stuff.
Yeah.
So I get feedback from them on those specific pieces, but the rest just comes from Graham.
One other question, and then I'll stop fucking hogging this thing. So Katie, Dr. Fredlin's my dissertation chair. Some of y'all may know her. And we have we have a really great relationship. I think we're very open with communication. And my chapters have been long. Like the last chapter I gave her was 45 pages. And I think 3 weeks is kind of the standard time to give people to read it. She's very busy and we have other research projects with that. She's told me before, she's like, don't wait for my feedback if you have a revision that you want to make. I don't follow that rule personally because I'm just like, but what if I completely revise it and then any feedback you give me is like, so I don't know, where do y'all stand on that? Like, when do you wait? Like, so you have feedback coming your way. When do you revise before you get the feedback? Or you like, what are your...
No. So how my committee and I do it is I send it, say I sent them chapter 2 for comments. I then start work on chapter 3. And keep writing and working on chapter 3, wait till chapter 2 notes come in, then I take a break from chapter 3.
Yeah.
And then I go back, work on chapter 2, get those notes incorporated, send it off, go back to chapter 3, send chapter 3 off, include the latest round for chapter 2. And so this is where that recursiveness that I was talking about comes in. And this is where all those breaks I was talking about come in. It becomes very easy to let a chapter sit for a week or a month so you can come at it again with fresh eyes that way. But then the main thing there is to keep working on other chapters. It depends on how statistical and how analytical, how much data you're working with versus how much like content you can work on your own for each chapter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
One thing you could ask Katie is like, because this is what Dr. Graham's been doing for me. So I've submitted chapters 1 through 4. And I told her, I haven't even opened her feedback on any of the chapters yet. I told her if there are major, like, this is wrong, you've got to fix it. Please tell me.
Yeah.
But if it's others, I have not even opened the documents yet because I'm not trying to get into that cycle again of where I can't let the paper go. You know, I decided that until I get through this, the results section and the discussion, I'm not even looking at the
Yeah.
feedback unless it's something major, you know, that needs to be changed for the structure of my dissertation.
And I mean, you can talk to your committee too about the kinds of feedback they give you and how they give it to you. So my chairs are Josh Phillips and Daryl Domingo. And so Daryl's notorious for doing way too much commentary. Like I swear he writes more on each chapter than I do. But we've talked about that. He knows that he does that. And so he works really hard to give me like a paragraph. And then Josh is very good about like, hey, here's the highlights. Like this chapter's a hot mess. You need to fix it. Versus, oh yeah, this one's really good. It's just these little quibbly things that you always do that you really should stop doing.
I will say that, like, as I mentioned yesterday, my dissertation chair was basically on sabbatical, and it would take forever for me to get comments from him. I was working with a professor. It was really kind of an interesting situation. She had kind of semi-retired and had moved from English to the musicology department, where she was teaching classes on music and text and things like that. But she also just happened to be the person who founded basically the equivalent of what Katie started here at U of M. She started the program at CU, and she started a bunch of writing groups and stuff. And even just from the writing groups, I started working with her very closely on editing, revising, proofing my documents, to the point where even though she was not on my committee, I invited her and wanted her specifically at my defense because she had been so involved with the process. And so I was getting feedback from her and from peers much more quickly from my chair. And so I just moved on with things. And then when I got feedback from my chair, I'd look through his comments, find the analogous sessions of my document, and reincorporate anything that he needed. But sometimes the comments that he had given me already were like, yeah, I've already addressed this.
Yeah, that the draft he's looking at was 4 months out of date or whatever. And
More like 4 weeks usually.
oh, well.
But this is also how I did the bulk of my writing in one semester, as opposed to everything leading up to it, was that because I was working and iterating much more quickly like that.
I will also say, you can, at the U of M, you basically have to be done writing the semester before you want to graduate, because it takes so long to submit all the paperwork and get it through the graduate school. So if you want to graduate in May, because all of the paperwork is due so early in the semester, you basically have to be done, have been finished already now before the semester starts. Otherwise,
Steadfast rule, right?
it's not a steadfast rule, but having worked in the grad school, it takes a long time to get
all that stuff to the grad school by that date, right?
Yeah, if you can get it all there by the dates, but all the paperwork has to be lined up, all the defense stuff has to be done. So if you're still working on chapter 1, you're going to have a real hard time finishing.
Oh no, I'm not yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
We had kind of said when we did like backwards math, and that if I have to find, if Dr. Graham's got the complete by the end of this month.
Okay.
You know, and I mean, not that that's the first time she's seen it. I mean, she's seen it plenty and all that stuff, but you know, so.
It just takes a little bit for, like, the committee has to read all of it, and then you have to get the defense in there. And if you have to make changes after the defense, like all this
summer wouldn't be the most horrible thing in the world.
Yeah. And then one of the things that I did is, as soon as you know when you want to graduate, go into the graduate website, find the dates. And like, I literally wrote them out, posted them on a piece of paper, and then checked them off as I hit them.
Yeah, that's the backwards math Dina was talking about.
Yeah. That is such a helpful thing. And I mean, I think I got my finished draft to my committee 2 weeks before my defense, and the defense was like a week before the date when all revisions would be due to the graduate school. I cut it close, and I do not recommend doing that.
Don't do that. No one in the graduate school will thank you for that. I literally would do the bulk of my hours during like the 2 weeks around the deadlines, because that's when all of them came in, and I would have like literal like multi-foot high stacks of dissertations stacked up that I would have to get through very quickly.
So where do we find those dates online? Because like I'm trying to walk in December, and I'm trying to submit my dissertation to my committee in September, which now I don't know if that's too late.
That should be okay. It's all on their website,
Okay.
which I linked in there as well. Let me see if I still have the tab open.
And like Lisa said, she will be sending me the link to her presentation, which will include all of the embedded links. And I will also throw this recording and everything up in there, which sadly, like I said, I did miss the beginning of it.
So that's the current student's website from the grad school, and it has all the info. You just have to dig through all of the links. The graduate school calendar is the one with all of the deadlines and stuff on it. So that'd be the
Here we
first
go.
place to look.
I just found this specific page and dropping that link in the chat.
I have one last question as far as like revisions go, and I don't know if anyone else is like having this problem. I know Dina does really kind of contemporary research with gaming and stuff. And it's something like I kind of talked about my committee, but it's so a lot of my research is like my topics are very contemporary and they're unfolding like as we speak. So like my first chapters really kind of vetted in critical race theory, which is under attack right now, and it's like evolutionary. And so like I'm gonna revise my first chapter, will probably be one of the last chapters I revise. Like everyone was just like, get a full draft before you go back to your first chapter because it's totally gonna change.
Yep.
You know, so I'm leaving it alone. But at that point, hopefully things will have either gotten better or worse with the current contemporary debate on that. And I always struggle with knowing when to cut it off because when you're doing current research, it can become outdated so quickly.
Yes.
And so I don't know like if anyone else is doing like really contemporary research and if they're really struggling with like this is going to be evolving and I could be out of date by the time this is finished.
Well, that's just good practice anyway. And this is something, again, that we teach our comp students is save your introduction for the end. So your first chapter, it sounds like you should treat the same way, where write the whole thing, go back to it at the very end. And that's just good practice in general, because so much will have changed over the course of the writing. No matter how fast you write, it's months from when you do that first chapter to when you do your last one. Your thinking will have evolved. You will have read dozens more chapters and articles. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but that's just good practice for everybody on this meeting.
Yeah, definitely.
I would say like, because you do kind of need to mentally have a drop dead date where you have to put the document to bed and stop tinkering. And
Yes.
depending on when you plan on defending, like I would almost say, unless something drastic changes, the beginning of the semester that you plan to defend and graduate should be that date, because by that point you should be done with the document proper, done with adding content, done with adding revisions and things, and
Mhm.
just be in the proofing stage.
Yep. The other thing you can do is include a sort of prologue to it that says, this is an ongoing evolving topic. The committee and I made the joint decision to stop making changes at such and such a date. Just,
Yeah.
so you have it and it makes you feel better. The flip side of that is the number of people that will read your dissertation is very low. If you need to make changes to it prior to publication of a book or separate journal articles, you can go back and make changes and do research as needed for those prior to publication. But the actual dissertation, just include a prologue. It can be a short paragraph that just says, as of March 1st, 2022, we decided to put a moratorium on doing additional research for these chapters.
Yeah.
So that we could continue through the process.
It can even be like just a 1 page or 1 paragraph author's note at the very beginning. Because and the thing is, like, no matter what you do, this is an ongoing topic and an ongoing conversation. So even when you publish the article or the book based on the topic, it's going to be always changing. So you just kind of have to you set that mental date in your head and you're like, okay, this is where it's done. And for anyone doing any research, this is a problem. Yours is just because literally the world is shifting under us. But for anyone, there's always that thing that stress and that anxiety with okay, when do I make that switch from doing research to focusing on the document itself? Because you have to stop researching at some point and just write the damn thing.
Yeah. And I mean, we all have that to some degree. where we can only use sources that are so relevant. If you're doing anything with feminist theory or critical race theory, you're not looking at stuff from the 80s much anymore. It's real problematic now, because it's practically 40 years old if it was written and published in 1980. Like, that's pretty dated. I like to think we've come at least a little ways since then. So it just, the time scale is different. You just have to say, we're done here.
Yeah, and I'd love to like chime in on that. So when I think about critical race theory, it sounds so like, you know, like something that's so separate from Black history, right? And it's not. And so if you were to sit there and you talk to a Black person in the day, you know, about critical race theory, you would find out how not new it is. I'll put it that way, right? So it's so funny to me as a Black person to have to defend what we all know as scholars is true, which is Black history in the moment. What we're seeing, like those things are real, they're not imagined, right? And so if you talk to other HBCU scholars, you know, to get more, because I am from an HBCU, my mother's whole family attended HBCU, historically Black college and university. Yeah, then you can get a more, you know, a newer feel, you know, to what critical race theory really is, and not like what people think it is because they're not in our skin. All right, I'm done.
No, that's an excellent point.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I really appreciate that feedback.
What other questions do you all have? I'm happy to entertain them as long as need be. I booked an extra hour.
Yeah, so I actually have one other question about the length of the chapters. So it's supposed to be like, what is a good medium?
So it depends on your field. Typically, a good model is monographs in your field. Look at how long their chapters are and think about what they would be. Obviously, a print book is formatted differently than a double-spaced Word document. But 20 pages printed is usually about 40 pages in Word. So that's a good sort of calculus you can do. So if your field is one where chapters, dissertation chapters are shorter, it might be 20 pages in a Word document. Other fields are much longer. Most top out about 45 to 50 pages, much longer than that. And it's hard to have a sustained argument that the reader can follow in a cohesive fashion. You have to be a very deft writer to have all of those threads come together without being overly repetitive, redundant. Nothing, nobody got that? Okay. So it just takes a lot more work and effort that we don't necessarily want to do for a dissertation. But about 40 pages is usually the sweet spot for most folks. But again, that's field dependent. So talk to your committee and see what they're interested in. It also depends on how many charts and tables and figures you have. So if you've got a lot of those, you need to account for that and say, oh, well, it's 40 pages, but 10 of them are actually images and 3 are, you know, a table here. So really my chapter is only 15 pages long. Whoops.
Yeah, I'll say that. Go, Dina.
I was just gonna say, for me, Madeline, my chair had me, my methodology chapter was 67 pages and they had me cut that in 2. So they said that was just too much, and my headers had to be too many tiers in to make things explanatory. And so it was better to just separate and have each chapter. So
organizational scheme depends on a lot, how things are laid out. The standards of your field will depend on a lot. Also, the format of your dissertation. If you're doing like that 3-article dissertation, that's going like the standard length of an article in your field is going to make that. If you're doing like the more traditional 5-chapter dissertation kind of thing, that'll do it. My dissertation and what the English professor that I worked with, you know, when I asked this question, she kind of yelled at me. I was like, stop thinking about length as the main thing. Your dissertation and your chapters are going to be as long as they need to be to make the argument and make the point. Now, that's a scary thing because literally one of the chapters of my dissertation, I think, ended up at about 12 pages, which was perfectly fine for what that chapter needed to do. Could I have combined it with something else? Yeah, I could have, but it would have weakened the overall organization. So it's the same question of like, how long is my dissertation supposed to be? It's that same sort of
field dependent. Some of the
Yeah.
science dissertations are 20 pages because they're 4 years of research boiled down to a single chart.
Mhm.
And then they just have 10 pages of methodology, 5 pages of discussion, and that's it.
And quantitative stuff tends to be longer too.
Yes.
I think 'cause you gotta put all that stuff in.
Yes. Whereas history, there was one history dissertation I looked at that was 897 pages
Jesus.
because they have to include so many sources and so many firsthand accounts and whatever. And even within the English literature section, you might have some dissertations that are 120 pages. You're also going to have some that are 300. It just depends on what you're studying, how much has already been said about it, how much background. I don't think anybody was here then, but Anna Esquivel's dissertation was on an obscure Iranian poet, where literally she's still living and there's 4 published articles about her. So her dissertation was much more theory heavy, but was very short overall. Whereas if you're writing a dissertation on Shakespeare or Faulkner or somebody like that, you have way more critical ground that you're going to have to cover
Mhm.
to have a cohesive, competent dissertation. But for our anxiety sides, about 40 pages
Yeah.
is usually a sweet spot. If you're wildly different, you want it to be for a very good reason with a particular plan. Like Michael, my first chapter, I'm having an introduction chapter, which is about 15 pages, and my conclusion is going to be about 10. But each of the body chapters are about 35 to 40.
Yeah, and the way mine was laid out is like I had 2 really big chunky sections, which I think those were each about 75, 80 pages total, but they each contained between 3 and 4 chapters, and it all made very logical sense the way it worked out. And so I could justify having like an 8 or 12 page chapter because it made sense to it. And that's the big thing. Any decisions like that, you know, make sure you have a reason you get to defend it in your defense.
Yeah. And I mean, talk to your committee about it too. Say, hey, this is how I think I want to structure it. Does that make sense? Are you cool with that? And they might have good ideas about how to do it differently or better or whatever.
Yeah, and it could be like in Dina's case where like a mammoth chapter really needs to be 2 chapters, or maybe 2 shorter chapters really should be 1 chapter.
They have me, yeah, I've got to like, I had to restructure quite a bit. We ended up separating it into, because I'm doing a quantitative and a qualitative.
Oh, girl.
They told me, you know, you're trying to do 2 dissertations. I was like, oh, no. But that was pre-COVID, you know. But so they had me, so I have like section 1, and it's, you know, my methodology, my results, my discussion for quantitative. And then section 2, my methodology, my results, my discussion for qualitative. So it's just 2 completely separate sections of the whole dissertation. So it really, there's, you know, as long as you can explain the choices you made is what I've been told, that a lot of times, as long as you can explain it, that you didn't just do it because.
Yeah. All right. What other questions does everyone have? Anyone have?
I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation today and the conversation. It was really helpful.
Of course. I was delighted to share.
Quick question. Does anyone need or want to meet with Peggy Callahan? Her time today was between 1 and 2, and we've been in this session the entire time. Was anyone hoping to meet with her today? Talk about paperwork or anything? Okay. Well, you all have her contact information. It is It's MCLLAHAN at Memphis. You can also find it on a lot of other places. But if you do want to meet with her to talk about paperwork, deadlines, all that kind of stuff, you can contact her. There's also videos on the DWR LibGuide, which I will email out, that show presentations from previous DWRs with the previous graduation analysis, who was Jennifer Beach, Dr. Jennifer Beach.
Yeah, she finished.
Yeah, yep, she graduated from here too. And now I think she's doing in instructional design kind of stuff. So you can watch those videos too that cover a lot of that kind of stuff as well. All right.
Okay, if anybody has any other questions, when we send out the PowerPoint, I'll include my email on that. So we can follow up later. Otherwise, good luck, keep writing. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be finished.
The best dissertation is a done dissertation.
You got it.
Thanks, Lisa.
Bye all.
Make